Welcome to this edition of the Capitol Brief. We're back here in our lovely studios in Tysons, Virginia, in our BL Media studios. Welcome back. Great to be back here. I am Seth Berenzweig, and joining again with my colleague, John Tamny. John, how are you?
I'm great. Good to be back.
Great to see you. I say that the cicadas are almost done. They're almost gone.
It seems quieter outside.
Yes. It's kind of like the hopes of the Philadelphia 76ers. They keep trying, but they're fading. So, but anyway, no rim shot. We're going to talk today about something that spun out of an interesting piece of journalism that ProPublica put out just a couple of days ago, and that, John, you've written about. And it was an interesting morning when ProPublica recently released a story of a number of prominent billionaires where they claimed that they got a hold of their taxes and proclaimed that people such as Jeff Bezos pay no taxes. And that, of course, sparked a huge debate of a lot of different orders of magnitude. But let me just ask for the audience to just briefly, can you recap what happened a couple of days ago with this event with ProPublica? And as to their description, were they describing it accurately or inaccurately?
They were describing it incredibly inaccurately in terms of what happened. But what did happen is that ProPublica illegally or basically released tax documents, tax information that was illegally leaked by the IRS.
Right.
Unquestionably, this is an incredible breach of trust. It speaks loudly to the shame of an income tax more broadly, where we have to prove our income to someone else. But that's a different discussion. And they tried to create the perception, of course, that these guys like Jeff Bezos, these very, very rich, the richest of rich billionaires, didn't pay any taxes. In fact, over the time in question, Bezos paid $4 billion in taxes. I find that monstrously unfair to Jeff Bezos. Why is it that he owes so much in taxes relative to me? And to read these journalists saying that, well, he paid nothing in taxes, and that's literally how they worded it. If they quit writing tomorrow, I don't think anyone in the world really would notice. If Jeff Bezos quit what he was doing, the world would be in revolt because we're so addicted and in love with what he's created. And so the idea that he didn't pay any taxes is laughable on its own, but again, it's unjust. Why does he owe more than I do? I don't get it.
So just so that I understand the factual predicate to your understanding, am I correct to say that the only way to really have a holistic and accurate view of what Jeff Bezos is contributing in terms of taxation that gets payable to the Internal Revenue Service or to the U.S. Treasury is based upon an understanding at a corporate level of the taxes that are generated and paid from the company at large? And since he is the controlling or one of the most powerful shareholders, once you break it down in a more accurate, granular corporate analysis, is that where you're getting that number from?
I'm getting that number. I can't say that I know exactly where the numbers come from.
I'm not suggesting that you went through it with the CPA, but just from a high level perspective, what's your understanding?
My understanding of it is that the reason the number is lower than what some might have expected is that just like you, me, Todd, and everyone we know don't pay taxes on gains that we haven't realized.
Sure.
Neither does Jeff Bezos. He gets the vast majority of his wealth is tied up in one of the greatest corporations the world has ever known. He hasn't realized those gains. That's precisely why he's arguably the richest man in the world. And so he doesn't get a lot of income. His wealth is tied up in a company. Well, that's generally not taxable. It shouldn't be. There should be a zero tax on that. It's obviously my opinion. And so his total taxes paid is lower. It's enormous by any reasonable standard, but it's lower than what some would expect.
So your viewpoint is that the ProPublica article, when it hit, which really made a big splash, was really partial and slanted in that they weren't looking at a big picture of what his corporate presence and what his business has generated from a taxation standpoint. They were taking into account other factors that didn't bring in a whole picture. I think it's also fair to say that there's, of course, a distinction between tax evasion and tax avoidance. Tax evasion is illegal. Tax avoidance is legal. And the interesting thing that I found from the article and the follow-up and blowback on social media was that the line between the legal and the illegal was getting curiously blended. And it started to smack of questions of patriotism and started to really show the usual flags of resentment, which is a word that keeps popping up into my mind when I'm seeing what people are viewing and talking about as it relates to people who we can say are rich. Are we in some aspect of a culture war with the rich right now in this country? From a business standpoint and from a societal standpoint, do we as a country have a problem with rich people? Do we have a problem in society understanding what they do or don't contribute to the economy?
It's a great question. I don't think we are. I think that's what some in the media want to be true. I think Americans love wealth. Let's never forget, love or hate them, Americans just elected what some would say was a billionaire president. We are the people. We are a different breed altogether as Americans. We descend from the very people who literally risked their lives crossing oceans and borders with very little wealth to our names in order to get a taste of freedom. And so it's no surprise that Americans are the most entrepreneurial people on earth, but also that they have a great reverence for those who are entrepreneurs. And so I don't think we're anti-wealth. And so it's frustrating for me in a broader perspective to think about this. It reminds me of a movie from the 1980s called 84 Charing Cross Road. This was not a blockbuster. It was an independent film.
Okay.
And you look back on this, there's a bookseller in London, there's a bookseller in New York. They want to know if one another has access to two specific rare books. Now think back to the 1980s. You didn't just pick up the phone and call someone. It was very expensive. There's no way of knowing this. They were writing letters back and forth, sending checks back and forth. Think how slow that process was. Mm-hmm. Because of Jeff Bezos doing something that was roundly rejected by everyone, Silicon Valley is littered with VCs who passed on Amazon and who passed on it as a public company. Mm-hmm. It was Amazon.org. This person, Jeff Bezos, talk about discrimination. He has been laughed at for decades until it was realized what Amazon could be. But here was a guy who made it possible for us to learn in split-second fashion where inventory was and able to get the world's plenty all with a click of a mouse. Mm-hmm. And so his reward for that is billions of dollars in taxation. He's being penalized for making our lives much easier. And I find it extra bothersome because when these innovators transform how we live for the better and give us something that we could not live without today, who is rewarded for this? But the political class. Somehow they get more the more that people who don't do what they do, who make it on their own, achieve and produce. I find it offensive on so many levels. And of course, ProPublica touched on none of this.
Well, the people who pay the taxes are the ones that pay the salaries of the people in Washington that you're referring to, right? If, the folks on Capitol Hill, the people that work there, and there are some good people that do some good work, but let's be honest, we pay their salaries. Mm-hmm. I find a lot of areas of interest in terms of this story. By the way, the one thing that I have been very curious about is I don't know how Donald Trump has spent the last 10 years keeping his taxes from being released. And then with the snap of the fingers, yes, half a dozen guys and billionaires, all of a sudden everybody's talking about and leafing through their taxes. So maybe they should have gotten one of those audits. We wouldn't be able to release it. They should have thought about that. But anyway, this does raise one question that I think some of the viewers would be asking. It really raises a logical question, which is, look, we have a situation going on in our country right now where, and I'm raising this because I know that a lot of the viewers will raise it, not necessarily because it's an exact mirror image of my opinion, but they would say, look, we have a fiscal shortfall in Washington. We have a lot of things that we need to pay for, especially as we're getting out of this crisis. And we have the less than 1%ers who are multi-billionaires. Would a wealth tax help drive economic prosperity? Isn't there some kind of an argument, they would say, to argue that the richest 100 billionaires in the country should be able to pay some kind of a reasonable wealth tax because it gives an opportunity for an additional funding mechanism to be able to pay for things that other 99.9% of Americans simply just don't have the capital to do?
Well, it's a two-part question. So some people will say, yes, as you say, there's a fiscal shortfall. We've got deficits. We've got debt of $30 trillion. My response is, why do we have that debt? Why does Apple have debt? Why can Apple borrow enormous amounts at near treasury levels? Why is that? Because investors trust its future earnings. We have enormous debt in the United States, not because of not enough revenues or because we spend too much. We have enormous debt because we have way too much in the way of federal revenues, and markets are expecting exponentially more federal revenues in the future. Individuals who have good prospects for the future can borrow. Corporations who have good prospects for the future can borrow. So by extension can governments that have arrogated to themselves a high percentage of the production of the most entrepreneurial people on earth. And so we don't have a fiscal shortfall born of not enough revenues. We're able to borrow at these levels precisely because Jeff Bezos is way overtaxed.
Borrowing on top of the tax
Yes,
income.
they're borrowing on the expectation that Bezos,
Right.
They haven't scratched the surface in terms of the wealth that Bezos is going to, and people like him. And people who will make him look small by comparison in the future will hand over. Right. That's why we are so in debt. Do you think Peru has this debt? Do you think Zimbabwe? Do you think Dominican Republic? No. It's because we're a rich country that we're so in debt. And so to say that we need to take more, that would just enable even more borrowing by Treasury.
It's an amazing inherent contradiction. Perhaps the richest country on earth is just getting soaked in debt right now, right? I'm glad that you brought up the point about the going on 30 trillion. I remember back in the good old days when it was only 22 trillion. And we're at a point now where it's difficult to imagine the end in sight in terms of being able to pay that down, and no one on Capitol Hill seems to want to talk about any kind of austerity or any conservative approach to bring that down. As business people, when we run a corporation, when we run a partnership, when we run an LLP or an LLC, if we have a line of credit with our lender, we are responsible to be accountable to it, to be able to pay it down, to be able to pay the bills, to be subject to a late fee if we don't pay it, and to be able to, in the background, be running a profitable business so that you can be someone who borrows responsibly, so that you have the ability to be able to have a business plan, so that you can demonstrate not only to your lender but to yourself that you have the ability and the plan to be able to pay that down. There is no plan that I can see in Washington for being able to do that. You brought in the other side of the equation. You have people bickering about whether Jeff Bezos is undertaxed. You have a very specific idea and an opinion which seems reasonable to me that he's in fact overtaxed. It's interesting to see how this kind of goes into a culture where some people do not get rewarded in mainstream America for being rich. Somehow Donald Trump became an exception to that, and I'll never quite understand why that is. But I remember when Mitt Romney was running for president against Barack Obama, and he was at an event, some kind of a charity event, and he wore a tuxedo, and he continued to get all of this guff about the fact that he was rich, and he stood up at the microphone and he was wearing his tuxedo and he said, "Finally, I'm able to wear something that I wear around the house on every day just to relax." And it was just his way of saying to people, "You're being ridiculous. Don't bust my chops because I'm rich. I don't hang in a tux, okay? But I am successful." And I think there is a little bit of a culture war there. There's also obviously a lack of discipline and a lack of actual fiscal policy in Washington about what to do to address the problems that you're talking about. But let's talk about the problem as it still stands. How do we address our nation's fiscal shortfall? Let me just give you one piece of information, before I throw that ball over to you. I was at a government contracts conference recently, and there was a government official talking about shortfalls and being able to afford things. And he said, we don't have a revenue problem. He said, we have a pay-for problem. And I found that to be so fascinating because in his mind, his only mindset as a bureaucrat was, how are we going to pay for this? Not how are we going to create some kind of a responsible budget like we have to do in our families, like we have to do in our businesses. Like, why do we all have to do that, but the folks in Washington don't have to do that? So I ask you, how do we best address the nation's fiscal shortfall? A lot of people are saying, well, just let Jeff Bezos take a bath. We have a problem. What's the answer to the problem?
Again, I think we have a problem of paradoxically too much in the way of revenues. Let's just imagine for fun something that never is going to happen. What if we had a head tax in the United States that did not regard wealth one way or the other? Do you think we'd have debt then? We'd be an incredibly rich country, exponentially richer than we are now. But we would have no debt. And we wouldn't, because if government has no access to the wealth we create, it cannot borrow against the creation of that wealth. We don't have a fiscal shortfall. What we have is that they own too much of Jeff Bezos' wealth. They own too much of Mitt Romney's wealth. There's nothing irresponsible about debt. Any good company is in debt for a long time. Amazon was in debt for a long time. Yeah. A good company takes major risks at first. And there are lenders willing to back those risks. There are equity investors willing to take on that risk based on a better future. I remind you again, Amazon was once Amazon.org. It was a nonprofit. Right. Debt's not the problem. And if you look at it as a nation, I don't care about debt. What I care about is spending. We have a spend. So this is why when people say, "Well, tax evasion," right? I would argue that it's a very patriotic thing to do because, see, a tax on Jeff Bezos is a tax on me.
How is that?
And it is because I am not improved. My economic chances are not improved if Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer and Donald Trump and Joe Biden have more control over the economy. Right. And so every dollar that's sent to Washington gives the political class more control here and now and the ability to borrow against it. Right. And so I'm harmed when Jeff Bezos pays a lot in taxes. Right. I am offended if he overpays. Right. I never say to the left when they say, "Oh, we're undertaxed," I never say, "Oh, well, feel free to pay more." I want you to pay less because it doesn't help me and it helps no one. Right. When people overpay in taxes.
Well, it also doesn't help the country. I mean, we're at a point now where we went from $20 to $30 trillion on the national debt. I think we're going to reach 40 before we reach 20, and that's not good for anybody. But yet the government is so arrogant that when they start seeing decentralized finance as a means to leverage down on creativity and technology and entrepreneurialism to create new mechanisms of currency, they start talking about banning it. And it's just really the height of arrogance and hypocrisy. And I think it's one of the reasons why one of the only immediate catalysts that I see that's going to help drive a change in Washington is financial pressure, which ironically is what helps businesses in the world of commerce, right? there's going to be a company, you believe, one day that's going to be the next Amazon, or they'll pressure Amazon, or there'll be another better Facebook. Maybe what Washington needs is a kick in the butt to be able to realize, you know what, if we don't digitize the U.S. dollar, if we don't take serious consideration of DeFi and start to take a look at being relevant again and being responsible again and accepting some kind of understanding that we can't continue to just borrow and borrow and borrow and borrow and then just go to Jeff Bezos and all of those other people and say, well, just continue to back up the truck. Maybe that's what Washington needs. Maybe they just need some good old-fashioned competition. And it's hard to know where this goes, but do you see any pressure that potentially comes down the pike on that? Is there anything that you see as a potential catalyst that's going to change things? Because things are just the same old deal in Washington these days.
No, I don't see it. I don't see the importance of Washington coming up with a digital currency. Why would we look to Washington to innovate? And furthermore, money is just a measure. It wouldn't change anything one way or the other. Looking at it more broadly, this is what scares me, and this is why I don't like the broad discussion around us about government. Because let's be clear, capitalists will continue to outrun politicians, and they will get better and better at it.
Right.
Probably 20, but easily 50 years from now, Jeff Bezos will appear small relative to the ability of talented people like him to create enormous wealth. Again, imagine if Jeff Bezos hit his peak in 1970. He maybe would have been a billionaire. He's worth hundreds of billions today precisely because internet and communications allow him to touch the lives of exponentially more people in better, more intimate ways. 50 years from now, Amazon will look primitive relative to what businessmen will be able to achieve then. And so what does that signal for Washington? It signals ever more revenues flowing in. And an ever greater ability to borrow against those revenues. And so it can't be about deficits. It can't be this tired argument that we can't afford it. Well, no, they can clearly afford it. Washington can borrow at the lowest rates in the world, and it can because it's backed by the most productive, innovative people on earth. To me, the only kick in the butt that Washington can or needs to get is if we, the people, have a reasonable discussion. It's not about affording these programs. We can easily afford them. But should we? There's just certain things government should not do. And Amazon proves it. Its very existence is a reminder of just how much better the profit-motivated are at meeting the needs of people than government is. Let's just, rather than spending cuts or percentage cuts, let's just end things that make no sense, and that's the vast majority of what the federal government does.
Would you feel more comfortable sending something by Amazon Prime delivery or by U.S. Postal Service? Rest my case. We have to wrap up here because we're going to start to run late. I would note that there are a couple of things that are going to be happening later this year. As an addition to the pressures that these high-tech CEOs are going to be facing, not only as it relates to the revenue and tax debate, but also as it relates to new initiatives that are happening on Capitol Hill with respect to potential amendments to antitrust legislation, because there are going to be calls to go after and break up big tech, which is a related but separate topic. We're out of time. Great to see you again, John. Have a great weekend, and see you soon.
Thank you.